In Caracas in 2018, a single bottle of children's Tylenol cost more than a mid-level government employee earned in a month. Not designer drugs, not black market weapons, children's fever medicine. The standard advice for hyperinflation protection is almost religious at this point. Buy gold, buy land, store food. It sounds solid, it tests well in theory. And across every documented hyperinflation of the last 100 years, the families who followed that exact playbook still got crushed. Not because the advice was wrong in principle, because it was incomplete in the one dimension that actually matters. Execution under chaos. The forensic record is specific. Exposed in personal diaries from Weimar households, declassified government memos from Budapest in 1946, and field interviews conducted by the Cato Institute's Steve Hanke during Zimbabwe's collapse. 5 protection strategies surface again and again among families who came through intact, not wealthy families, ordinary ones. And not one of those 5 shows up in mainstream financial advice. Move 1. The barter shelf. Here is something the gold crowd will never tell you because it demolishes a story they need you to believe. In the American occupation zone of Germany between 1945 and 1948, the Reichsmark was technically still legal tender, but nobody used it. The economy didn't run on gold either. It ran on cigarettes. This wasn't metaphorical. American cigarettes became the literal unit of account in post-war Germany. A carton of Lucky Strikes could buy a winter coat. A single cigarette could purchase a loaf of bread. The Office of Military Government for Germany, United States, OMG-US, documented this in extraordinary detail. Their economic reports from 1946 and 1947 show that cigarettes functioned with more monetary stability than the actual currency. They were portable, divisible into single units, universally desired, and impossible for the government to print. The families who had stockpiled American cigarettes before the currency's final collapse weren't smokers. They were operating a private monetary system inside a broken one. This pattern repeats with disturbing consistency. In Venezuela, between 2017 and 2019, the believer lost over 99.9% of its value. The Cato Institute's Hanke Cruz hyperinflation table clocked Venezuela's peak monthly inflation at roughly 234% in late 2018. Inside that maelstrom, a parallel economy crystallized almost overnight. Basic hygiene products, deodorant, razor blades, toothpaste, soap, became functional currency in Caracas neighborhoods. A bar of imported soap in certain barrios traded at purchasing power equivalents that would have been laughable 12 months earlier. Not because soap is inherently valuable, because soap is small, storable, universally needed, impossible to counterfeit, and, critically, available in denominations that match the scale of daily transactions. That last point is the one nobody talks about. It's the same structural problem that undermines gold during acute hyperinflation, but applied in reverse. Gold fails as a transactional medium because its value per unit is too high for everyday purchases. A barter shelf of essential goods succeeds precisely because each item's value maps onto the size of a real human need. You don't need to make change for a bar of soap. The specific items that function best as barter currency share 4 properties that the historical record identifies consistently. They must be non-perishable, divisible, or available in small units, universally needed regardless of social class, and difficult to manufacture locally. During Lebanon's financial collapse beginning in 2019, when the pound lost over 90% of its value against the dollar, the items that emerged as informal currency included baby formula, antibiotics, batteries, and imported coffee. In Zimbabwe during the worst months of 2008, diesel fuel and cooking oil functioned as exchange media in rural areas where formal currency had ceased to circulate entirely. The uncomfortable implication? The first step in hyperinflation protection isn't financial at all, it's physical. A dedicated storage space in your home stocked with rotating supplies of high-demand essentials, medicine, hygiene products, shelf-stable calories, batteries, basic hardware, is not survivalist paranoia. It is the oldest and most consistently documented first line of defense against currency collapse. And it costs almost nothing to build, starting now, before anyone else in your neighborhood is thinking about it. Because the window for building a barter shelf closes the moment everyone realizes they need one. In Caracas, the pharmacy shelves were empty 8 months before the media acknowledged what was happening. Move 2. The 18-month window. This is the part that should change how you think about every bank account you currently hold. On December 1st, 2001, the Argentine government announced the corralito. The word means little corral, a pen for livestock. The metaphor was precise. Overnight, every bank account in the country was frozen. Depositors were restricted to withdrawing 250 pesos per week. Savings accounts denominated in dollars were forcibly converted to pesos at an artificial exchange rate. Then the peso was devalued by 70%. People who had trusted the banking system woke up robbed, legally, by their own government. The critical detail is timing. The corralito was announced on December 1st, but the Argentine economy had been visibly deteriorating for over 2 years. IMF bailout negotiations had been public since mid-2000. Capital flight among wealthy Argentines and multinational corporations began in earnest by early 2001. The data was in the open. The signals were loud. 18 months. That's how much warning ordinary Argentine families had. Most of them used none of it. The pattern is forensic. In Cyprus, March 2013, the government imposed a bail-in on bank deposits above 100,000 euros at the Bank of Cyprus and Lakey Bank. Depositors lost up to 47.5% of their uninsured holdings, converted to equity in a failing institution. The Cypriot banking crisis had been building publicly for over a year. Greek bond exposure, over-leveraged banks, repeated ECB warnings. The smart money, Russian oligarchs, according to widely reported Reuters and Financial Times investigations at the time, moved billions offshore in the months before the bail-in was announced. Local savers who trusted the system ate the loss. In Greece, June 2015, the government imposed capital controls limiting ATM withdrawals to 60 euros per day. Months of visible negotiation failures with the Troika preceded the announcement. Greek citizens who had opened accounts in Bulgaria, Germany, or the UK before the controls, and thousands did, preserved their liquidity completely. Those who waited were locked inside a system that was actively being dismantled around them. The BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, often called the Central Bank of Central Banks, published working papers throughout the 2000s, documenting the sequence that precedes capital controls and currency crises. The pattern holds with remarkable consistency. First, visible macroeconomic deterioration. Then, elite capital flight. Then, public denial by government officials. Then, emergency legislation restricting movement of money. The gap between the first visible warning and the imposition of controls averages 12 to 24 months. 12 to 24 months of open road. And most people drive straight past the exit. Ray Dalio's framework and principles for navigating big debt crises categorizes this phase as the pre-crisis normalization period, a window where macroeconomic data is deteriorating. Elite behavior is shifting, but public confidence and government messaging maintain the illusion of stability. The dangerous feature of this window is that daily life feels normal. Stores are open, salaries arrive, the currency still works, just a little less each month. That slow erosion is precisely what prevents action, because the human brain responds to sudden shocks, not gradual slopes. The operational lesson is specific. If you live in a country showing early-stage monetary stress, rising debt to GDP ratios, central bank balance sheet expansion, widening current account deficits, political instability around fiscal policy, the single highest leverage action available to you is opening a bank account in a jurisdiction with a stable, independently managed currency. Not moving all your money, moving enough to cover 6 to 12 months of family expenses. Doing it while the roads are still open and the transaction is still legal. This isn't hypothetical planning. This is the documented behavior of every family that preserved its financial footing across the Argentine, Cypriot, Greek, and Lebanese crises. They didn't predict the exact date. They read the conditions and moved early. The people who moved late found the exit already welded shut. Move 3. The debt inversion. Everything you have been taught about debt is calibrated for a stable currency. That calibration becomes suicidal guidance during hyperinflation, but not in the direction you'd expect. During stable times, debt is a liability. You owe future dollars that are roughly as valuable as today's dollars. The interest compounds. The obligation is real and heavy. During hyperinflation, that equation flips completely, and the flip creates what might be the single most counterintuitive wealth preservation mechanism in economic history. In Turkey, between 2021 and 2023, the lira lost approximately 75% of its value against the dollar. Turkish citizens who held fixed-rate mortgages denominated in lira, and there were millions of them, watched something extraordinary happen. Their monthly payments, fixed in nominal lira terms, became trivial in real purchasing power. A mortgage payment that once represented 40% of a family's income gradually shrank to the equivalent of a restaurant dinner. The house was still there. The debt was evaporating. Ray Dalio lays out the mechanism with clinical precision in Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crises. When a government prints currency to cover its obligations, which is the terminal behavior of every documented hyperinflation, the real value of all fixed-rate, domestically denominated debt collapses in tandem with the currency. Borrowers win, savers lose. This is not a side effect. It is the primary mechanism through which hyperinflation redistributes wealth. The Argentine crisis of 2001 to 2002 produced the same inversion. Families with peso-denominated mortgages on physical property saw their debt obligations destroyed, while the physical property retained its real value. Those who had been aggressively saving in peso-denominated bank accounts, doing the responsible thing, watched those savings get frozen, forcibly converted, and devalued into irrelevance. The operational principle for a family reading conditions of potential currency stress. Fixed rate, long-term debt in your domestic currency, deployed into hard assets, residential property you will live in, land that produces food or income, physical infrastructure with utility value, is not a risk during hyperinflation. It is a structural advantage. You are borrowing in currency that is dying and purchasing assets that will survive the death. The math in Weimar is the most extreme illustration. Adam Ferguson documented in When Money Dies that a Berlin schoolteacher who had taken a modest housing loan in 1919, the equivalent of several years' salary at the time, found by late 1923 that his entire remaining mortgage balance could be repaid with less than the price of a single newspaper. The bank received its marks. The marks bought nothing. The teacher kept his apartment. The bank's shareholders absorbed the loss. This wasn't an anomaly. It was the median outcome for every fixed-rate borrower in Germany. This does not mean lever up recklessly. It means that if you are currently sitting on a low fixed-rate mortgage, and your instinct is to pay it down aggressively because debt feels dangerous, pause. Under inflationary conditions, that mortgage is working for you. Every month that passes with the currency weakening, your real obligation shrinks. The discipline is counterintuitive. Hold the debt, deploy the cash you would have used for extra payments into the other 4 strategies on this list. The families across Weimar, Argentina, Turkey, and Lebanon, who emerged with the most intact financial positions, shared one behavior. They were net borrowers in the collapsing currency and net holders of tangible assets. The financial establishment calls this reckless. The historical record calls it the only strategy that consistently worked at the household level. Move 4. The hard currency earn. This move is invisible in financial advice because financial advisors sell products. They don't restructure earning capacity. And earning capacity is the variable that separated survival from devastation. In every modern hyperinflation with a functioning internet. Zimbabwe, 2007 to 2008, the Zimbabwe dollar was losing value so fast that prices doubled every 24.7 hours at the peak. The Cato Institute's Hanka measured this with daily price sampling in Harare. Government salaries became worthless before the pay period ended. Professionals abandoned their posts. Doctors, engineers, teachers, anyone with credentials that had international demand, left the country or pivoted to earning in foreign currency through any available channel. The ones who couldn't leave did something else. They found remote work. It sounds anachronistic for 2007 Zimbabwe, but the IT sector in Harare had a small population of developers and technicians who had been doing contract work for South African and European firms via early freelancing platforms and direct relationships. These individuals, earning $200 or $300 per month, a pittance by Western standards, were functionally among the wealthiest people in the country. Their cost of living was denominated in a currency racing towards zero. Their income was denominated in a currency that wasn't. Venezuela made this phenomenon unmistakable at scale. By 2018, the minimum monthly wage in Venezuela had collapsed to the equivalent of roughly $6. A Venezuelan graphic designer earning $15 per hour on an international freelancing platform was making more in a single hour than most Venezuelans earned in 2 months. The math is staggering, and it wasn't theoretical. Academic researchers at Venezuelan universities and journalists covering the crisis documented entire neighborhoods where the economic hierarchy had inverted, where young people with laptop skills and foreign client relationships were supporting extended families of formerly middle-class professionals. Lebanon after 2019 produced the same pattern. The pound's collapse meant that anyone with a remote income stream in dollars, euros, or sterling experienced a dramatic increase in their local purchasing power even as the national economy disintegrated. Diaspora remittances, Lebanese abroad sending dollars to family, became the country's primary economic lifeline, surpassing all formal economic sectors. The structural lesson: your most valuable hyperinflation hedge might not be an asset at all. It might be a skill that someone in a stable currency country is willing to pay for. Software development, translation, design, accounting, tutoring, medical transcription. The specific skill matters less than the currency it's paid in. If your entire income is denominated in a single domestic currency, you are running the same concentration risk as someone whose entire portfolio is in a single stock. During normal times, that concentration is invisible. During a currency crisis, it is the single variable that determines whether your family eats. Building even a partial income stream in a foreign hard currency, before the crisis forces you to scramble for one, is not a career decision. It is a monetary hedge with zero downside during stable times and potentially infinite upside during collapse. The Venezuelan freelancer didn't lose anything by earning dollars when the believer was stable. When the believer died, that income stream became the most valuable asset in the household. Move 5. The trust ledger. This is the one that will sound soft until you understand what it replaced. In southern Lebanon, during the worst months of the pound's collapse, the formal banking system ceased to function for ordinary people. ATMs were empty or rationed. Wire transfers were blocked or delayed for weeks. Credit cards were useless. Merchants couldn't process transactions in a currency that changed value between the swipe and the settlement. What replaced it was old, older than banking itself. Informal credit networks, built on personal reputation, family ties, neighborhood trust, and handshake agreements, became the functional financial system for millions of Lebanese. A baker extended bread on credit to families he'd known for 20 years, tracked in a paper notebook. A pharmacist held medicine for a neighbor's child, repaid 3 weeks later in diesel fuel. A mechanic fixed a generator in exchange for a month of produce from a rooftop garden 2 streets over. This isn't primitive. It's the system that humans used for thousands of years before formalized banking existed, and the system that instantly reactivates the moment formalized banking breaks. Anthropologist David Graeber documented this extensively in his work on the history of debt. Credit networks based on personal obligation predate coinage by at least 2,000 years. They are the original financial technology, and they are anti-fragile in a way that no digital banking platform can match because their collateral isn't money, it's reputation. Zimbabwe's informal economy during the crisis operated on similar architecture. Stockfuls, community savings groups originating in South African townships, spread through urban Zimbabwe as formal institutions collapsed. Members pooled resources, took turns accessing the collective fund, and enforced participation through social pressure rather than legal contracts. The default rate was remarkably low, not because the legal penalties were severe, there were none. Because defaulting on your stockful meant your entire community knew you couldn't be trusted. In an environment where trust was the only functioning currency, that was a death sentence. In Argentina, after the Corralito, neighborhood barter clubs, Clubs de Trick, exploded from a handful of enthusiast groups to an estimated 2.5 million participants by mid-2002. These weren't ideological experiments. They were emergency economic infrastructure built by desperate families who needed to transact and had no functional currency to do it with. Participants traded goods and services using locally issued vouchers backed by nothing except the collective agreement that they had value. The system worked, imperfectly, chaotically, but it worked, because the participants knew each other. The operational principle is this: your network of trusted, reciprocal relationships is a financial instrument. It doesn't show up on a balance sheet. It can't be frozen by a government. It can't be devalued by a central bank. And in every documented hyperinflation, it became the infrastructure that carried families through the gap between the old system's death and the new system's birth. That gap, historically, lasts between 6 months and 3 years. The families with strong community ties made it through. The ones who had optimized purely for financial preparation, gold in a safe, cash under a mattress, a diversified portfolio on a screen they could no longer access, discovered that a hedge you can't trade is just an expensive artifact. Building that network isn't something you do when the crisis starts. It's something you do now, in ordinary times when the gestures look unremarkable. Know your neighbors by name. Establish reciprocal relationships with local producers, farmers, mechanics, medical professionals. Participate in your community in ways that create genuine mutual obligation. None of this looks like financial planning. All of it, when the formal system seizes, functions as exactly that. Here's what you just absorbed, stripped of its historical packaging. Every financial institution, every advisor, every mainstream publication gives you hyperinflation guidance built for a world where systems still function. Buy this asset, hold this instrument, diversify into this category. That advice assumes banks still open, assumes markets still clear, assumes you can still transact in the instruments you hold. The forensic record of what actually happens to families during acute currency collapse says something different. It says the families who survived best operate on a parallel architecture that didn't depend on the system working. A physical inventory of tradable goods that functioned as microcurrency, financial footing in a stable foreign jurisdiction established before the exit closed, fixed-rate domestic debt that the inflation was quietly destroying on their behalf, income flowing in a currency their government couldn't print, and a network of human relationships dense enough to substitute for the institutions that had failed. None of these 5 strategies requires wealth. None requires connections. None requires sophisticated financial knowledge. What they require is the willingness to act before the consensus acknowledges the problem, which, across every hyperinflation in the historical record, happens approximately 18 months too late. The Cato Institute has documented 57 hyperinflation episodes since 1795. In every single one, the population divided into 2 groups. The first group trusted the official narrative, held their domestic savings, followed conventional wisdom, and waited for the situation to improve. The second group read the conditions, acted early, and built a parallel structure that didn't depend on the system they could see failing. The gap between those 2 groups, measured in generational wealth, has never closed, not once, in any country. After any hyperinflation, the information is not hidden, the historical record is public, the Cato database is free, Dalio's work is published, the diaries from Weimar are translated, the Lebanese experience is still being documented in real time. The only variable is whether you build the architecture while the weather is still calm. Because the one thing every hyperinflation survivor agrees on, Weimar, Hungary, Zimbabwe, Argentina, Venezuela, Lebanon, is that by the time the average person accepts what's happening, the 5 moves that could have saved them are no longer available. The shelves are empty, the borders are watched, the bank accounts are frozen, the freelancing platforms require a bank account you can no longer access, and the neighbors you never spoke to have already formed their own networks. Without you. That is not a warning designed to scare you. It is a description of a documented sequence that has played out identically. In countries with different cultures, different governments, different economies, and different centuries. The sequence doesn't vary, only the names change. Subscribe. History has the answers. The question has always been timing.